Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be venturing to the middle of nowhere, but not before reminding you that the book, written in part by me and mostly in part by two other extremely talented writers, is launching tomorrow. The link is in the description if you want to check it out and pre-order it. It would mean a lot. But for now, get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I grew up in the South. Tons and tons of beautiful places to see that haven't been taken over by concrete yet. It's nice, but along with that it's pretty boring. Being a teenager and wanting to go out and have fun led to mostly improvising with your buddies and hoping something good would come out of the night. There wasn't really a local spot to go hang out, like a club or a cool bar, and the places that were closest to this were boring, because you did them so many times. I'm sure if you've ever lived in a rural area, you can understand that feeling completely. Something that I found a ton of enjoyment in as a teenager was cruising around super late at night listening to music. I would fill my gas tank up, grab something to drink, a cigarrillo, and I would just take off driving around until the sun came up. It was a way for me to just clear my mind and relax. Those country back roads were always fun to drive down at 2 a.m. and was also just the right amount of spooky. Well, one night, I absolutely got more than what I bargained for. I can't remember which month it was in exactly, but I knew for a fact that it was in the summertime because I was out of school and also remember it being a comfortable, chill night. So, if I had to guess, it must have been around July. I was cruising around like I always did and was completely worry-free. I had music blaring and I was in my zone. I decided to head down to a park just out of boredom. This particular park is at the very end of a long stretch of desolate country road, but it was a really pretty drive because of that. When I say desolate country road, I don't mean that it's some dirt road that goes through the woods or anything crazy like that. It's a normal paved road, but there is really nothing on it after a certain point. The entire road takes about 20 minutes to drive down to get to the park, and after about 10 minutes into the drive, the houses start to get spread out further and further, to becoming no houses and just roads leading into the park. I think a lot of the reason I liked this drive at night, it's because of how creepy it was, and I looked at it as some sort of adventure or whatever. The park isn't open for camping or anything. It's mostly just a lot of land with walking trails and biking trails set up through miles of woods. So obviously at around 3 a.m. in the morning, it's pretty dead. I made it there and just did a slow and normal little loop around the park. The night before, it stormed very badly. So badly, in fact, I remember my parents and I had to take shelter because of the threat of a tornado touchdown. There ended up being no tornado, but the storms were pretty damn rough. Because of this, I came up on a fallen tree in the road that looped around to the exit of the park. That must have happened because of the storm. It wasn't some massive tree or something, but I knew for a fact that there was no way I could have gotten over it in my car, obviously. It was pitch black everywhere besides the front of my car because of my headlights, and just because of that, I immediately ruled out backing up the entire way. I just drove where I entered the park. I knew that was super dangerous, and there was no way. At this spot on the road, there was flat land on each side of me. I figured that would make most sense to just back up in the grass beside me, just a little, and then drive back the way I came. It was a long, one-way loop around the park. but I wasn't really worried about going out the wrong way since it was so late. So I started to back up off the road so that I could get my car turned around. All was good until I went to pull back up onto the road. I totally didn't take into account how wet the grass was and the amount of mud. My car went absolutely nowhere. My back tires were completely stuck and was spinning in place as I was trying to floor the gas pedal. I started to become pretty scared at this point. Not the most ideal situation to be in. I immediately take my cell phone out my pocket and saw that I had service, which was a huge relief. I called my parents and told them what happened and where I was. They were pretty pissed at me, but said that they will pay for a tow truck to come get me out. My parents both drove small 4-door sedans, and they would have been zero help in this situation. I was about 45 minutes away from my house and the rest of most human civilization, so I realized that I would be stuck out there for at least an hour before someone was able to come and get me. It was a freaky feeling, but I tried getting it out of my head and just continued to listen to music and be on my phone in the car while I waited. Not really much more I could do. After I kind of calmed down from the initial anger I had, I started to check out my surroundings. I didn't even notice at first because of everything going on, but in front of my car's placement was a field that was full of the most amount of deer I think I've ever seen at once. There legitimately must have been at least 40 just walking around and eating grass. The field wasn't directly in front of my car, but if I was to get out and throw a rock in that direction, it would have been easy for me to be able to hit one of them. So, I'd say around 30 yards away. This didn't really help with the creepy level going on. Looking out in the front of the car and seeing 80 eyes reflected staring back at you is a bit alarming, but I was relieved it was just a field of deer. I watched them for a little bit, but I was quickly over it and started to just browse through my social media apps while I waited. They seemed to have gotten over it quicker than I did, because they all went back to walking around and eating once they figured out I wasn't going to do anything to them. I browsed my phone for about 15 minutes, when I finally got a call from my parents letting me know that a tow truck guy is on his way and about an hour and a half from my location. Still to this day, I remember hearing that and having the thought, you've got to be kidding me. I understood that me and only me was the reason I was in this situation. So I couldn't really be mad at anyone else, but that was very obviously not what I wanted to hear. I decided the smartest thing for me to do was to make sure all my doors were locked, lay back in my seat, and take a nap to pass the time quickly. So that's what I did. I wake up 45 minutes later to the feeling of being watched. I'm not sure if anyone has ever experienced that feeling before, because I don't know how common it is. But there was a sixth sense alarm going off in my head, telling me that I needed to wake up. Waking up to that feeling in the situation I was in, and the surrounding I was in, is probably worst case scenario. I sit up and immediately check my surroundings and see nothing. I looked through my car very quickly for any sort of weapon and found a pocket knife. I was very scared, even though I heard and saw absolutely nothing. That feeling is terrifying. I was shocked to see that the field of deer in front of me was still full of deer. I don't know anything about the animal, but I guess I always just assumed they didn't hang around in the same place for too long. I called my parents back to see if they had any kind of update from the tow truck. I decided to not mention the feeling I was having because I didn't want them to worry more. Then I also knew that it was literally nothing more than a feeling I had, and had nothing to back up why I was feeling that way other than just being spooked out in general. No update from the tow truck guy, so we assumed Everything was still fine on his end. The call lasted just a few minutes because I felt like such a dweeb. They both had to wake up for work in a few hours and now have to spend another random $100 on top of it all, and they were worried about me too. I could tell they were annoyed at the situation, but worried. I told them I'll make sure to tell them when the guy arrives, and that I was sorry. We hung up, and I looked up from the phone and immediately went from 0 to 100 in panic mode. The deer in front of me were all completely perked and staring in the same direction, right of them. Let me remind you that there are around 40 deer in this field. Every single one of them was stopped dead in their tracks, standing completely still, looking at something. I put my high beams on and started waiting for absolutely anything to happen at all. Nothing. I tapped my horn real quick, and they didn't even budge or look my way. They were all still completely glued to what was by them. The way the tree line was, I couldn't see that far over into the field. I knew they were looking into the woods by them, but where I was only able to see them. I could hear my heartbeat. I grabbed that pocket knife and just waited for something to happen. I would say it was about a minute after I honked. Every single one of them in unison started to run in the opposite way. They were running at full speed, and within 20 seconds the field was devoid. I was petrified in fear. I knew that staying in my car is what would be the safest thing to do, but it's the worst feeling in the world when you feel like a sitting duck. My head was on a swivel. I was freaking out in every way possible, and I assumed that it was a bear or something, but it could have been absolutely anything. I was convinced at that point it was the devil himself. I don't know what to do. I knew that the tow truck was close by, but I had no idea where he was. I began to shake because of the nerves and just looked around to make sure nothing was with me, and focusing on the field in front of me. I did this for what felt like an eternity, sitting in complete silence and darkness in the middle of nowhere, waiting for something to jump out and attack you. 15 of the longest minutes of my life go by, and I start to see lights break through the tree line on the road. As it gets closer, I see it's the tow truck guy. The lights on his truck felt like it was Jesus coming from heaven to rescue me. He gets up to me, and I jump out my car and immediately ask him if he has a gun on him. I told him very quickly what just happened, and that something is definitely out here nearby. He let me know he had a shotgun in the truck, and assured me that it was most likely a bear or bobcat. He gave me the whole, "They're more scared of you than you are of them." The tree was small enough for him to sort of bulldoze it out the way, and then he attached my car to his and pulled me out of the spot. He was very nonchalant about what I had just experienced, but I was pretty badly shaken up from it. The whole time he was doing his thing, I had my eyes glued out in that field waiting for something. He was completely done in about 15 minutes, and told me to follow his truck out of there onto the main road again. I got in my car and was ready, more than anything, to get the hell out of this park. We started to drive away from that spot, and I still had my head on a swivel, completely shaken. As we were driving away, I look in my rearview mirror. We were down the road, just a tiny bit, but I could still see the spot that I was stuck in. It was partially lit from the vehicle's lights and the moon. I watched in my rearview mirror as a man came out of the tree line behind where my car was and walked into the middle of the road and watched us drive away. My heart stopped beating. Legitimately, I lost my breath and my eyes started to get full of tears because of how absolutely scared I was in this moment. I couldn't see any sort of detail like what he looked like, or even necessarily what he was wearing. To be honest, I didn't really care. The feeling that I felt driving away from that spot, knowing he was right there the whole time, watching me, as I was freaking out and looking around, watching me as I was completely alone for the longest time, maybe even coming right up to my window and watching me as I slept. That's a feeling. That's something I can't necessarily put into words. All these years later, and it still messes with me quite a bit. The entire time we were driving off, as long as I could see him, he didn't move, just watched us in the road. A million things went through my mind. I was scared there may have been multiple people up the road waiting for us. I was trying to figure out if I could start beating on my horn like crazy to get the tow truck guy to stop or not. I decided that all I wanted to do was to get out of there more than anything. And the second that we finally got out of the park and were able to go onto a 2-lane road again, I flew past the tow truck driver and did nothing below 70 miles an hour the entire way home. I flew through the stop signs and absolutely did not care. The only thing on my mind was making it home. I got home, ran inside, very quickly acknowledged my parents and said sorry and thank you, and went to my room. I didn't get a single second of sleep for the rest of the night. I was searching for any sorts of records of things happening in that area, escaped convicts, similar stories, and I came to the conclusion that the man was some sort of squatter or homeless. I read many things online about how common it is for homeless in rural areas to build shelters in the woods, which does make sense. But obviously, the unknown is the scariest part of it all. What if he wasn't homeless? What if he was going to hurt me? What if? There are so many possibilities of what could have happened. But the outcome that did happen is what I am most grateful for. I never told my parents this story until many years after it happened, and I was already an adult and moved out. It freaked them the hell out too when I shared it. I never went back to that park, ever. Even though I no longer live by there, I still have no desire to go near there at all. I don't think I even could in broad daylight with a ton of people around. I also made the decision to stop doing these late night cruises. I did a few after that time with people, but even then I felt uncomfortable and on edge. So man in the woods, let's never meet again. I live in a rural area, about 30 minutes west of Palm Springs in Southern California. My cousin and I decided to go hike in some hills that are about 20 minutes north of an area called Oak Glen. There was no trail to get back into the hills. We actually had to trespass on a fire camp and follow a stream up towards the hills. We start climbing the hills and reach the peak of a particularly steep hill. I realize we are way away from where I parked the car, and I don't even know where the road is. On top of all that, there is a heavy fog rolling in, and we only have about 35 minutes of light left. We attempt to take a shortcut down the hill by sliding our butts down a steep slope, and to our dismay, we end up on the side of a 30-foot rock wall. Long story short, we managed to scale down the rock wall, but not before a football-sized rock falls on my cousin's head, and he starts bleeding pretty badly and is heavily disoriented. We walk in the direction we think the car is in. The fog is heavy all around us now, and we're not sure if we're going the right way. My cousin is bleeding from his head, when all of a sudden we come across a long 40-foot building with thick concrete walls set mostly below ground level, like a bunker in the middle of a forest. The windows had bars on them, and the door was heavy steel. My cousin wanted to check it out, but I was getting a total bad vibe from it. He was saying something was drawing him to it. I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I wouldn't let him go in. Just a super eerie feeling. Shortly after we passed the house, the fog let up a bit, and we luckily stumbled onto a foot trail. Weird note. We went back a few weeks later during full daylight and looked for the place, but seriously couldn't find it again. We hiked around there for hours. My wallet also fell out my back pocket when we were sliding down the hill, back when we were far from any trails. My ID showed up in the mail a week later in an envelope with no note or sending address. I'm an 18-year-old male, and I moved from my hometown in with my mum about a year ago now, into a farmhouse pretty much in the middle of nowhere, on the east side of Australia. It was at the very end of a 7-kilometer-long driveway that had 2 other houses on it, both with elderly couples in them, and a 30-minute drive away from the nearest town, which is very small, with only 1,000 inhabitants. I'd feel really uncomfortable some nights when I was outside having a cigarette. The old feel like you're being watched feeling. And occasionally would wake up to hear footsteps outside, and I'm sure they didn't sound like the sheep and rams that were near our place. I have a history of drug abuse, and I'm quite paranoid because of it, so I tried to rationalize it by telling myself I was being paranoid. One night, I awoke at 3 a.m. and needed to take a leak. When I looked out my bedroom window, and very briefly see a flash of light, like it had come off a torch on a phone. Seeing as though we live in the middle of nowhere, this freaked me out a lot, and I stayed up until morning listening and looking out but hearing nothing. Maybe a week later, my dad wants to cut the grass. He hops on the lawnmower to realize its tires are slashed, which he blamed on me. But I didn't care because it's just further enforcing the idea that there was someone lurking around in the property. My mum knew I wouldn't do anything like that, and instead thought the neighbor had done it. I always chatted with the neighbor when I went for walks, and I liked him and really doubted he could have done it, let alone be able to walk that far as he was quite old, and if he came in a vehicle late at night, we all would have heard it. My stepdad ended up moving out, because he's a drinker, and I witnessed him on the verge of being violent with my mum, and intervened. So he moved out next day, and we haven't seen him since, thankfully. With him gone, and it only being me, my mum, and my 3-year-old sister there, and considering we can't legally own a gun in Australia, and the cops taking a good hour to get here if we needed them, I got increasingly paranoid about the things that had been going on, because I felt I had to be protective. Some nights I would stay up very late, and before going to sleep would turn off all the lights and walk around silently, looking around the windows for any sign. And sure enough, on a few occasions, I would see torches way off in the distance in the middle of the cow paddocks, as if someone saw all the house lights turn off and started to make their way over at 3 a.m. Which is weird to say the least, considering that in every direction, other than towards the other houses on our road, there was absolutely nothing but bush and paddocks for a good 20 kilometers. I should add that our front door didn't properly lock and should easily be opened by just messing with the handle a bit. So I started putting a wheelbarrow up against the door and a metal sheet behind the wheelbarrow, so if the door opened it would make a very loud noise that would definitely wake me up. A few weeks went by, and I saw and heard absolutely nothing, so I began to get much less paranoid and was thinking about it a lot less. One night, I had gotten back from the pub and was still a bit drunk on my phone in the lounge room. All the lights were off because my mum and sister were asleep, and I was just laying there texting and listening to music. We have 2 cats, and on this night they were frisky and running around wildly. So when I heard the metal sheet, I figured it was just the cats and ignored it. then walked straight past it to my room maybe a half hour later, not giving it a second glance. The next morning, my paranoia immediately came back in full swing, and I proceeded to freak out when I saw that not only had the sheet fallen over, the door itself was ajar, and the wheelbarrow had been moved a good 6 inches as well. There's no way in hell one of my cats could have done that. The only explanation I have for this is that somebody tried to let themselves in, heard the bang, and ran off. A few nights after this, my mum woke me up late, maybe 4 a.m, to ask me to come out to her car with her, because all of her car lights were on, and she didn't want to go out by herself. We went out, turned off all the lights, and brought the keys back, which we usually just leave in the car with us inside. The car battery was dead, and we had to get our neighbor to come down with jumper cables the next day. She certainly didn't want any of the lights on, and all of the doors were shut, meaning somebody went inside, pressed the button on the roof, put the keys in the ignition on the accessories, and exited and closed the door, with what we think was the intention of draining the battery. She began agreeing with me that somebody was lurking around the house, and told me a few things she had noticed that she didn't want to tell me because I was already anxious and didn't want to put me more on edge. Like when the tank water started tasting funny, and she found a half-decomposing possum on the grate on top of the tank. She didn't mention how she couldn't possibly see how it could have ended up there, unless it happened to die right there on that exact spot, and somehow didn't start making the water taste funny until it was decomposed so you could see its bones, and how a garden rock was moved in a weird position right outside her window, as if someone was using it to stand on to look inside. The house closest to the road had multiple dogs, and the one that I was friendly with, who lived closer, maybe 3 kilometers from us, had a gun, and often shot rabbits and foxes, so that definitely made us the easiest target. All of this made both of us very concerned, and we ended up finding a house and moving about a month later. I know this is anticlimactic, but it still freaks me the hell out, and I can't think of any other explanation than someone lurking around our house for multiple months. There were many times when no one was home all day, and if they wanted to steal from us, they could have easily have come in and taken all our stuff, but nothing was ever missing. Might just be overthinking it, but I truly think they had some very sinister intentions and were intentionally messing with us. I'm a teenager. Me and my mother live alone. We live basically in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town is less than an hour away, and the only things we have near us are a gas station and a bar. I know everyone who lives near me, and we rarely ever see new people in our neck of the woods. So just seeing someone who isn't familiar is suspicious enough, so this was pretty creepy. A few years ago, it was the middle of the night. Me and my mother are night owls. We like to be awake from midnight to 6 a.m, the time most people prefer to sleep. My mother was watching TV in the living room, and I was using the computer in the kitchen. The kitchen and the living room are basically connected, so I wasn't too far away from her, only a few feet. The front door leads right into the living room. It's a door with 9 windows, so it's pretty easy to see into. My mum looked towards the door, and she saw someone staring at her through the window. He was wearing a hood that obscured almost all of his face. My mum jumped, and she of course walked into the door and asked what the hell he was doing. According to my mother, he looked pretty young, but she could barely see his face, so who knew how old he was. The man said something along the lines of, "Can you help me with my car, please?" in a tone I can only describe as miserable and off-putting. Even though it was dark out, there should have been enough light for her to see a car, and there was no car. The man was also holding his pockets pretty tightly. My mother apologized and said no. This caused him to grip whatever was in his pockets tighter still, so tight his arms began to tremble. He stayed for a few more minutes, and then he had swiftly disappeared. Throughout the night, maybe 1 or 2 hours later, we thought we'd hear slight weeping, but we didn't see anyone at any of our doors and windows. I may be making assumptions here, but I can only assume it was a weapon he was holding in his pockets. This was a creepy as hell experience, and it's safe to say he was going to lure my mother out of the house to do something sinister to her. A year ago, there was a very small metal plate jammed between the front door strike plate and the piece that goes inside of it. I'm not sure what it's called. We have zero idea where this metal plate came from, but the metal plate stopped our doors from locking, so I'm assuming it was just put there so that someone could get in. These things are probably unrelated, but it made me think of him, because this was deliberately placed there by someone, and we're not sure why. When I was 17/18, I was driving home from a friend's house after a movie marathon. It was around 1 a.m. when I left for a decent drive. Not quite halfway, my gas light came on. I had a few creepy catcall experiences at gas stations and was a little paranoid stopping that late in the middle of nowhere as a 110-pound teenage girl. In the end, I think if I wasn't so cautious, I could have been taken or worse. The first gas station I came across was well lit and in a pretty open space. I drove up to the pump and looked around my car mirrors before getting out. As I was starting to pump gas, this normal-looking guy comes out of the gas station shop and starts smoking a cigarette. The pump kept clicking off and not working, so I started messing with it to try to get it to pump. This guy starts watching me laughing. I assumed he was just laughing to himself, watching a teenage girl trying to pump gas, and after getting maybe 1/4 of a gallon, I gave up and moved to a new pump. At this point, if I didn't do absolutely everything I did, I would have been screwed. When I got back into my car, I locked my doors just to drive to the other pump. I checked all of my mirrors before getting out and shutting the car off. An old 90s Beetle that didn't always start right away. That's when I saw the guy walking up to my car. He was smiling, walking up to the driver's side window. Not wanting him next to me, I rolled down the passenger window, and he paused for a moment, then smiled to himself and walked to the passenger window. He stuck his head all the way inside my window to talk to me. "Hey, I know this seems really weird. My car broke down, and I need a ride home. It's just a half mile up the road." "Sorry, I don't know you." "Oh, no, I totally get it. I just thought it was pretty weird as I was walking up here. But it's only a half mile up the road and I'm totally stranded. I wish I could help you out, but I really don't know you." "Yeah, I got you. If you had a truck or something, I'd offer a ride in the back." "Sorry, no." All of a sudden he looks pissed. He yanked at my door, but I had locked it. Then he reached for my inside door handle through my window. My car was still running, and I slammed it into first and peeled out as he opened the door. The car taking off slammed it shut, and I sped off and called the police as I got away. They looked at the gas station cameras, and right after I left, he got into his red SUV and drove off. If I hadn't have locked my doors the second time, I would have been screwed. If I'd have let him come to the driver's side window, he would have grabbed me. And if I'd have shut my car off, I wouldn't have been able to drive off in time. If I didn't double check my mirrors, I would have been outside my car when he came up to me. I had been at my cousin's wedding, which was across the country. We had to stay at a hotel at the time. We'd been up since 8 a.m. and spent the whole day celebrating, so everyone was tired. My dad had been drinking and wasn't able to drive us back to the hotel, so my mum, my sister and I made plans to get a lift from my auntie and uncle. My dad and my brother went with my other auntie and uncle. So anyway, we had left the venue and had been driving for about 10 minutes down a dark, deserted one-way road. Everything was fine. I was sitting in the back seat with my mum and sister, and we were all just chatting, although I was half asleep. That was until my uncle cursed under his breath and the car slowed down. This woke me up fully, because I knew that the road was very long, and there were only trees on the sides of it. Also, I was young, and I believed that cursing was a terrible sin. When the car stopped completely, I sat up a bit, trying to see what was going on. Then I saw a man walking towards the car. This couldn't have been as scary as it was if it wasn't pitch black in the middle of nowhere, and if the man didn't have a load of glass shards in his face. It was a horrifying sight. There were pieces of glass in his skin. It was so bloody. There was even a big shard sticking out of his cheek. He knocked on the window and motioned for my auntie to roll down hers. She rolled it down a little bit. "What do you want?" my uncle asked. "Could you give me and my friend a ride to the hospital?" the man with the glass in his face asked. Friend? I thought to myself. I couldn't see another man, and that's when a second man walked out from the bushes. He also had glass in his face. It was so bloody. The second man walked over to the driver's side of the car where my uncle was, and he asked my uncle to roll down his window as well. My uncle complied, but like my auntie, only rolled it down a little bit. "Can you please give us a ride?" "I'm sorry, but there isn't any room," my auntie said. The first man looked to the back seat, as if he didn't believe my auntie, and we made eye contact. It was probably the scariest 5 seconds I've ever experienced. Just then he pulled on the handle of the car door and it opened. This is when I started to panic, and I could feel my mum tense up. My auntie struggled with the man to try and close the door. Luckily enough, the man seemed like he had been drinking, so he wasn't as strong as he would have been if he was sober. The second man didn't seem to be doing much. He just seemed to be watching the whole thing play out. Finally, my aunt was able to close the door and lock it. "Just take this, I'm sorry." My auntie scrambled for her purse and pulled out a €20 note. I can't remember if the man took it or not. The last thing I do remember about the night was my uncle driving away as fast as he could. I just spoke to my sister, who was 16 at the time. Apparently her and my mum never told me this part, but I was really freaking out at the time and they didn't want to make it worse. Off on the side of the road they had spotted multiple figures hiding amongst the bushes and trees. Who knows how many people were actually there, but they guessed at least 2 or 3. What made it scarier was the next 20 minutes left on the deserted road. We all sat there digesting what could have happened. In her words, I don't know what they were planning, but I'm glad we never found out. I'm used to going on long drives by myself, and whenever I'm down I take my bike and ride far away from the city to the outskirts. But if it's dark, I feel safer to take the car. One night I was driving in a very secluded area with lots of trees and bushes. There were no lights or anything, and the road was very narrow. This wasn't the highway or anything, just a road leading to a secluded outskirt of forest. As I continued driving slowly, I noticed 3 men approach me from the opposite direction on a single bike. When I got closer, they stopped and tried to block the road. Initially, they were signaling me to stop the car, but later one of the guys stood in the middle of the road. I noticed he had some sort of stick or weapon. I pressed the accelerator as hard as I could and drove on the bushes and escaped from them. I don't know what they were doing in the middle of nowhere and why they carried weapons. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd have stopped my car. Turns out there had been a murder in the area, and a body was buried, and a case is being investigated. I'm not entirely sure if that's connected to mine. Back in September, I was taking hunter education classes with my dad. Basically, you learn parts of a gun, how to handle a gun safely. Since it was in person and not the online classes, the instructors had stories to tell. These were about people not handling theirs correctly, drunk shooting, and the like, and as you can imagine, most of them didn't end well. We were going shooting a lot these 2 weeks to prepare for the test at the end. One time we went to an abandoned town that a lot of people shot at. It had been shut down due to high lead levels. I had butterflies, and the whole ride I brushed it off as nerves. That evening, we were the only ones there. We thought it would be pretty nice since there'd be more spots open. We settled on a spot behind a hill and shot another hill nearby. My dad was sighting the .22 gun we had brought, and I was sitting behind him. My earplugs were in, so it was hard to hear things, especially far away, when all of a sudden, there was a very loud shot. It had to have been my dad since it was so close to him and loud. I was initially scared, as the previously mentioned stories we were told of shots being accidentally fired never ended well. In a concerned voice, I asked if it was my dad. When he said no, my fear became much greater. Another shot was fired, and our only thought was to become seen. We quickly unloaded the gun so it was safe and ran up the hill. My mum was wearing yellow, and we were all jumping up and down waving our arms. There was no way we couldn't have been seen. After 2 or 3 more shots, we ran to the edge. It was like a valley or dried out lake. The edges were very high, and we were at the bottom with the shooter at the top. The next part confirmed our belief that they had seen us, and still continued anyway. My dad called the police to report what was happening. He walked further out to see details like the color of the truck and how many people, and was in the view of the shooter. Just a bit after my dad got on the phone, the guy left, probably assuming the cops and other authorities were called. We wished we had brought the gun, because we were convinced he was shooting at us. We stayed where we were for a long time waiting for the police, when a group of maybe 4 high schoolers came. My dad went and warned them about the previous events, and we decided after 15 minutes of waiting and no police arriving, and we just wanted to get out of there. We went avid, gathered our stuff, and I looked at where the shots had went with some goggles and something that told distance. The shots were no more than 25 meters away. If he had bumped the gun just a bit, we would have been dead or in the hospital. Driving away, the police finally came. They asked us some questions, and we were finally able to get the hell out of there. He was unfortunately never caught, and we never went back there. We don't know if he was trying to mess with us, trying to shoot us, or just drink. But we were terrified for our lives. I used to ride a motorcycle as a sole method of transportation when I was studying, and I used to work on hotel cocktail bars during the summer holidays. 6 years ago, I was working at a historic, stereotypical grand hotel in a very rural area of the UK. I worked a long afternoon and evening into the night, finished cleaning up the bar around 2 a.m, and walked through the underbelly of the hotel to retrieve my motorcycle and make the journey home. I can still clearly remember the feeling of the crisp night air and the absolute pitch black silence of the countryside after the hot and seemingly never-ending nights of serving drinks to dinner-goers and party-goers. It was always sort of intensely relaxing. Now that being an adult meant not being scared of the dark, or being outside on a motorcycle in the middle of nearly nowhere at 2 a.m. Riding through the local towns took me a few minutes before I left to follow a dark country road home. At this point, I rode a Honda 125cc, around 11 horsepower. Basic and old, but clean. It did the job, regardless of its quirks, such as the dim headlights, which would dim and flicker, even more when coming to a stop. I was riding along these pitch-black roads with fields and woods surrounding me, very much alone for 20 minutes. Then I saw a brief blast of blue light headlights in my mirrors coming from behind. Moments later, dazzling headlights arrived behind me in seconds. Almost immediately, a large Range Rover pulls out to overtake me, blasting past barely inches away from me, and I respond with a long blast on my horn. The Range Rover pulls in front of me and slams on the anchor, in what seems like an attempt to have me lose control under my sudden braking or rear-end the range. Bikes can, even when they're old and rely on dumb brakes, stop pretty quickly. So I didn't rear-end the maniac in front. I came to a controlled stop. I see the door of the range crack open and a figure began to step out. I went for it, using all 11 horsepower of the little Honda's power, pulling an overtake. However, in those moments, this anger-crazed maniac had shut his door and stepped on the accelerator, causing us to be level and accelerating together when I reached his car. He then started to run me off the road, pulling to the right, wedging me further over towards the ditch at the side of the road. And this is where I ended up struggling to control the bike on the wet, dew-heavy grass around the side of the road, trying to stop the 140-kilogram motorcycle dropping into the ditch. I struggled to regain balance, but managed to pull the bike back onto the road. At this point, I noticed the guy had gotten back out of the Range Rover and walked around the back, opened it, and was reaching inside. I had turned the bike to face the other side of the road, ready to turn either way and make an escape from the escalating situation. Just as I looked to turn, I took one more look over at him and see him pulling a large object out of the back of the range. I just went for it, taking another glance over my shoulder around 200 meters to see he continued driving up the road away from where I'd ran off the road. I slowed down to see what he'd do next. After driving away from me, he reached the top of the road and pulled over to the left, waiting for me, the light reflecting on the road. It was eerie. My heart was beating so fast, yet it felt like time had stopped. I just carried on in the opposite direction to find an alternate home route in the pitch black. Just before doing this, I checked my phone for signal to see that I had no mobile coverage at all. Fantastic. I remember a time I was almost taken when I was a kid. I lived at my grandmother's house out in the middle of nowhere, Texas. Our neighbors lived closer to the main country road, and my grandmother's house was on the back of a 5-acre lot. Across the main street was an army depot. Nothing but woods and yellow daffodils. My parents were at work, and my grandparents were in the house watching the Golden Girls. My father had bought me a bike as a birthday gift. I'd just turned 9, so I was riding my bike up our long driveway. Our neighbor to the left, a really old elderly woman, had no one to visit her or speak to her, so I often played at her house and helped her with anything she asked me to. That day, I wanted to show her my new bike. She was sitting on her porch when I visited her. She had no errands or chores for me, so I talked to her for about 15 minutes and showed her my bike. When I returned to my own driveway, I had been riding back and forth for about 15 minutes, listening to music on my MP3 player, when I had this sudden nauseating pain in my gut. I looked around, only to find a car passing by. I recognized it as my elderly neighbor's car and waved to her. She stopped long enough to talk to me, as she pulled into our driveway just far enough that the tail end of her car wasn't in the street. A white van marked with some electronic company's name and a ladder on the roof passed by. In our area there was only one electricity company. The one on the truck wasn't it, so I found it strange. A good 10 minutes passed when I noticed the van was driving by again and going in the direction it had come from. Perhaps the person was lost, I thought, and kept speaking with my neighbor. She gave me a bag of her garden tomatoes and cucumbers for my grandmother before telling me to head home. I watched her as she drove away. Then that sudden pain returned, and I had forgotten all about it. I looked up to see the white van was driving in my direction, going much faster than it had been. Something inside me screamed to run, to do something, whatever it was, but I had to get away and do it fast. I dropped the bags in my hand and ran across the small pasture to my elderly neighbor's house. She was no longer on the porch, but her house was much closer than my grandmother's. As I hopped over the neighbor's fence, the van sped up as it cut into my neighbor's driveway. I made a quick decision to run up the back steps instead of running around the front of the house. My neighbor had a long wrap around the porch, and her driveway was small. If he had intentions on taking me, it would have been too easy for him to catch me, trying to run around the front of the house. I was in tears as my neighbor locked her door and called the cops. She'd seen everything and called my grandfather first. It would have taken way too long for the police to arrive. My neighbor put me in her room and locked the door behind herself. Moments later, I hear banging on the front door. As terrified as I was, I looked out her bedroom window to find a tall and lean man standing on the front porch. He looked like he might have been in his mid to late 20s. Dark hair, blue jumpsuit like Michael Myers, and he had aviator sunglasses on, and I could see he had a dark beard. He banged on the door once more, then began walking around the house. He was looking in the windows when my grandfather arrived. The very moment he saw him, the man ran back to the van and sped off. I'm 25 now, and thankfully, never saw that van again. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. As a reminder, the book that I didn't even write part of it, that I sort of inspired, is launching tomorrow. So please be sure to check it out. It really would mean a lot to me and the two writers and everyone over at Forge Fiction, which is how the book started off to begin with. To think, if they hadn't have contacted me, this book would never have been written. So that's saying something. A huge thank you to all my incredible patrons. As always, you guys are wonderful and really help keep the channel going. So if you'd like your name at the end of every video, feel free to check it out, and for as little as $1 a month, you can get some pretty awesome perks. Anyway, if something scary has ever happened to you and you would like to share it to potentially have it read in a video, you can share it to my email or Reddit. And if you do that, it may one day be in a video. Just please be sure to put in plenty of good grammar, punctuation, and paragraphing and stuff. Food for thought. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.